sighting network at the Sea Lab, where I've been for about 7.5 years. And so I'm going to kind of take over where Mackenzie left off yesterday and talk about the other side of our research program. And hopefully you walk away learning more about manatees and our research that's ongoing at the Sea Lab. So this slide should look pretty familiar to you. This is what Mackenzie would have introduced yesterday. So just as a refresher, our marine mammal research program at the lab is divided into these two sister networks. So you heard from Mackenzie as the stranding coordinator of the Alabama Marine Mammal Stranding Network yesterday. And then today you're going to hear about the other side, the Sea Lab's Manatee Sighting Network, where I am the manager. But we do a lot of crossover work and obviously know each other and work together well. So it's a great team down at the Sea Lab. So to begin, I'm just going to dive into some background on manatees as a species. So manatees are under the order Sirenia, which if you think about, if you know manatee folklore and that the sailors long hundreds of years ago used to mistake these guys for mermaids. So that's where Sirenia comes from, mermaids, sirens, Greek mythology. So that's how I always remember. And there's 4 species of extinct species in the order Sirenia. So there's 3 species of manatees. We're going to focus today on the West Indian manatee, which is found in the southeastern U.S. And in Central America and the Caribbean. There's also the Amazonian manatee and the West African manatee. And then in the Indo-Pacific, you have the closely related dugong, which is a little bit different. The most striking difference is they have a forked tail, more like a mermaid, instead of a round tail. And there's also 1 species in the order Sirenia that is actually extinct. It's called the stellar sea cow. These were the largest species and the only cold tolerant species. And they actually went extinct just a couple hundred years ago from overhunting. So they're a really kind of unfortunate but great example of how quickly humans can impact these animals. So going further into talking about the West Indian manatee, and specifically the subspecies that we have here in the U.S. is called the Florida manatee, although we'll learn today, if you don't know already, that doesn't mean they can't go outside of Florida. They are protected at the state level and federally. So when I first started at the Sea Lab, they were on the endangered species list and listed as endangered, which is the highest classification of threats. But about 2 years ago, they were downlisted to threatened, and it's estimated now that there's about 8,000 manatees in the U.S., which is about double what it was 7 or 8 years ago when I started this job. So it's a great recognition of recovery efforts and protections and what the Endangered Species Act is supposed to do. But the way these guys live and where they live still puts them at great risk. So they're very large animals and typically slow moving. You heard a lot about dolphins yesterday. They're also large, but much more athletic, much more agile. These guys, not so much. They're mammals, of course, so they live near the surface, and they eat vegetation. So they're spending most of their time in shallow water where different seagrasses and submerged vegetation will grow. And because of these things, one of the biggest threats to them are boat strikes. So you'll see a lot of manatees have these propeller marks from encounters with boats. And last year was actually a record year for numbers of manatee deaths attributed to boat strikes in the U.S. at 136. So this is an ongoing threat for these guys. Another thing that can be harmful to them are harmful algal blooms, or what we call abbreviated as HABs. You guys might be familiar with red tide, which is a brevetoxin and affects their respiratory and nervous systems. And actually, year before last, in 2018, there was a record red tide year in Florida with almost 300 manatees dying. In our region, while we have had documented boat strikes and red tide related deaths, most often the cause of death for manatees here in the Northern Gulf is cold stress. So these guys are a subtropical species and don't do well in water below about 70 degrees for prolonged periods of time. So that's why in the winter you see them gathered at warm water sites like big springs or power plant outfalls. And then kind of an ongoing, threat in the background to these guys is habitat loss. So they live in these coastal areas where people also live. Most of the US population and the world population lives right along the coast. So we're sharing the same habitat and sometimes encroaching on things that these guys need. So to give you an idea, focusing in on the US and when I was talking about their thermal tolerance, so traditionally Florida manatees are found in Florida, right? We know that the core population resides in peninsular Florida, and this is where warm water sites are that they go to in the winter. So this is where the big springs are or the power plants that they go in, and you see these huge aggregations of manatees all trying to stay warm. But during the warmer parts of the year, like now, it's the water temperature and the air temperatures are nice and warm. These guys can migrate outside of Florida and are actually becoming more common in these outlying areas. So here in the Northern Gulf, in Alabama and Mississippi, where we really focus, but as far west as Louisiana and Texas, there's actually already been a manatee sighting in Texas already this year. And we see the same thing happening on the Atlantic coast. So in Georgia and the Carolinas, there's more and more manatee sightings, and sometimes we even have sightings as far north as New Jersey and Massachusetts. But this is a relatively new phenomenon. As there's more manatees and the water temperatures are warming, there's more going outside of Florida. And so there's still not a whole lot of data on these outlying habitats and what the manatees do and where they go when they travel here. So that's where we come in. In 2007, the Manatee Sighting Network was established at the lab. Basically, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was getting more frequent reports of manatees in Alabama, and they wanted to learn more about what was going on, and were these guys lost, or was something changing that they were coming to Alabama on purpose and for resources that they liked. So to help answer that question, the sighting network uses what's called citizen science. So this just means that, instead of me and Mackenzie and maybe a couple of the other people listed on that front slide, going out and trying to look for manatees and count manatees, and probably never seeing one unless we get really lucky, we rely on publicly reported opportunistic sightings. So people who work or live on the water or like to go fishing and boating, maybe just drive back and forth across the bayway every day, they're going to see manatees just naturally. And so we ask that they report those to us. And it's allowing us to collect data on a really large time scale and a really large spatial geographic scale that just wouldn't be possible with a small research team, and honestly would cost a lot of money to try to do with just a bunch or a handful of researchers trying to do it. So we have several ways that you can report to us, and I really hope that you guys will go play around our website and like us on Facebook as well. And we operate these pretty much 24/7. So we have an emergency line for stranding response and then a non-emergency line for sighting reports. The website, email address, and Facebook page, and then sometimes just getting sightings face-to-face, whether we're out on the boat or sometimes I just run into people and they see I'm wearing a Sea Lab shirt and they want to tell me about the manatee that they saw. And this time of year, we're already extremely busy with sighting reports. It's nice and warm out, like I said. So I'm monitoring all of these reporting options all the time. So this is how you report to the network, but are we actually learning? Like, that's the point, right? We're trying to learn about these animals. So what have we learned so far? Well, as I mentioned, but here's a great quantitative way to look at it. The number of sightings is increasing every year, and it's an exponential increase. So the first live manatee sightings that we know of in Alabama were around the early 1980s. But since around 2007 here, when we started the network, you can see that the sightings have just gone up and up. And yeah, definitely part of that is people having a centralized reporting agency and outlets to report to. But also our evidence, shows that it's simply because there's more manatees. And so to give you, a really quantitative comparison, for the couple of decades before we started the sighting network, there were only 200 recorded sightings of manatees in Alabama. But since the sighting network began in 2007, we've had more than 3,000 sightings. So that tells me that it's not just that there's a number to call and more people knowing to report, it's that there's actually more manatees coming to our area. The other kind of big question that we hope to answer is, well, where are they going? So typically manatees migrate here seasonally. So from about early April through early May, we start to see them migrate up to our area. And then they leave again, usually in the fall, about late October to early November. And then that time in between, they're really broadly using our coastlines and our local river systems. So unlike the dolphins that Mackenzie talked about that rely on marine habitats and spend time in saltwater and actually don't do well in freshwater, these guys are kind of the opposite. They actually need a source of fresh water, and they spend more of their time up in these brackish or freshwater environments. So a lot of the local river systems are up in the Mobile-Tensas Delta. And this is also where a lot of the food that they eat resides. So these guys eat purely vegetation, and they can eat 100+ pounds of food in a day for an adult manatee. So they're really going where the food is. And around here, we don't have the same kind of marine seagrasses that they have once you go over and get into Florida. Most of the vegetation they eat in our area is more freshwater or brackish water vegetation. So they're definitely going up into these river systems where the grass grows. And we're able to see some of these cool travel patterns. So for example, over here in Baldwin County, we can see how manatees travel right along the coastline as they're coming into the Northern Gulf, or also they use the intercoastal waterway here. And we've actually just had a paper come out last year talking about how manatees actually use the intercoastal waterway and other shipping channels as travel corridors, just like the ships do, which is some interesting stuff that we found from our data. We can also identify some of these habitat hotspots. So this is a rough kernel density plot. Basically, warm colors mean more manatees have been seen there. Cool colors mean less manatees. So when people kind of ask, okay, where should we look out for manatees, make sure we don't hit them with our boats, this is the kind of plot that gives us that idea. So we know that Dog River is a really popular spot for manatees. Also areas around Fowl River, Perdido Bay, Wolf Bay, and the central portions of the Mobile-Tensas Delta. So these are definitely areas that you should know to look out for manatees a little bit. And I'll just briefly talk about this slide. This is a summary of not just Mississippi and Alabama, but other states in the Northern Gulf and then along the Atlantic coast. So I really just want you to take away from this slide that this is a phenomenon, the increased sighting reports, that's really happening around the southeastern U.S. So the same types of information that we're learning from Alabama and Mississippi, we're also seeing in these other states. And while the majority of our sightings are reported from Alabama, where most people know us from the Sea Lab, and where we can do targeted outreach efforts to ask people to report to us, we get sightings from anywhere that people want to call us. So I've gotten sightings from, I think, about 12 different states. And when I've also gotten sightings from the Bahamas before, and from Puerto Rico. So we have a really, really large data set of understanding where manatees are occurring. So I want to switch into talking about now that you know a little more about how the sighting data works, what about other research activities that we do? So if we compare the citizen science data with targeted research activities, it starts to be like pieces of a puzzle that we're putting together to more fully have a picture of what's happening with manatees and how we can contribute that information to help protect and conserve them. So these are a few examples of research activities that we conduct. Photo identification is one of my favorite things that we can do. So each manatee has almost all of them have had some kind of encounter with a boat, and so they have propeller scars. And you can actually use those scars like a fingerprint to identify individual manatees. And we know from photo ID that we have the same manatees coming back to the Northern Gulf year after year. We also have sighting histories for some of them in Florida going back to the late 1970s. So we can get an idea of how old they are, how many babies they've had over their life, or how often they've had babies. Do they travel and hang out with the same manatees regularly? It's just a really cool tool to be able to track animals for a very long period of time, and it's non-invasive. So we're just using something that's, you know, happening from photos to learn more about them. We also do a lot of habitat monitoring. So my lab is particularly interested in trophic ecology and diet analysis. So we are taking a lot of vegetation samples and also poop samples, if we can get them from the manatees, to better understand what these guys are eating and what types of plants might be important to them. We also regularly monitor temperature and salinity and oxygen levels to see how that might affect their movement in and around Mobile Bay. And then the last thing I'll talk about on this slide is aerial surveys. So this is Kayla. She's a PhD student, you'll see in a few slides. And she's been our primary spotter during aerial surveys. I like to stay on the ground. I am not much for flying in a tiny little airplane. But we've done a couple different types of surveys. One, looking for manatees. So you can cover a lot of ground and have a great angle to look for manatees. And so we're using this to try to get some abundance estimates. And then we've also done thermal imaging surveys. So this is an image taken with a thermal camera up at the Berry Steam Plant, which is a power plant up in the Delta. And we're really looking for warm water refuge sites, much like they have in Florida, that manatees might be able to use up here in Alabama. Even if maybe they can't stay there year round, they could at least use them for short periods of time during a cold snap. Or if we have a mild winter, as we've had the last few years, maybe they can stay and overwinter by using these types of places. Another big thing that we do as far as targeted research is tagging and tracking manatees. So we're the first group to tag manatees in Alabama. And we tagged our first manatee in 2009, and she was appropriately named Bama as the first Alabama tagged manatee. Tagging a manatee is quite an undertaking. So to kind of walk you through these pictures, we again use an aerial observer. So it's again very hard to spot manatees in the water around here. It's pretty murky and it's hard to see them. And to cover a lot of ground and find manatees, you know, when you have a whole team ready to capture and tag them, we have someone up in a plane who's surveying and then telling us on the ground on the boats where that manatee is. We work with a lot of partners from other agencies. So primarily with SeaWorld Orlando and their rescue team. They have this specialized boat that the back comes out and the motor is up in the front. We also work, you can see UF, University of Florida's veterinary team has worked with us in the past, and Sea to Shore Alliance, which is now based out of Clearwater Marine Aquarium, are kind of the tagging experts in the manatee world. So once you spot a manatee, from this boat, we deploy a large net around the animal, and then have a lot of strong people pull the manatee up onto the boat. Once they're up on the boat, they typically tend to kind of settle down. So while of course they don't enjoy being caught in a net, they, again, unlike a dolphin, don't have small articulating ribs. They actually have big, strong rib bones, and their lungs run along their back. So they're okay sitting out of the water for a little while. And it's kind of like, you know, if you fell in the water, you might freak out at first, but then realize, you know, hey, I'm okay. And that's kind of what these guys do too, and they settle down. Still, we only keep them out of the water for an hour maximum. And during that time, we're doing a full health assessment. So the veterinarians really take over. They're doing things like ultrasounds, lots of different length measurements. They're taking blood samples, pit tags that we put, just like your dogs, just like Rudder has a microchip. We put a pit tag in them that acts the same way. And then the tagging team attaches one of these satellite tags. So this is, again, a non-invasive way to tag them. So there's this flexible belt goes around the skinniest part of the manatee at the base of their tail, which is called the peduncle. And then from there, we have a flexible tether and a buoyant tag. And this is what it looks like when the manatee is in the water. So this is a manatee swimming. This is her snout up here, and she's trailing this tag behind her. And probably the #1 question I get is, what happens if this tag gets caught on something? It is designed with weak links here and here, and the belt also has weak links, so they do break away if they get caught, and it actually happens fairly often, and these tags are quite expensive, so you hope if it breaks away that it keeps transmitting a satellite signal so you can go and recover it. And if you're really lucky, the manatee might still be in the area and you're able to reattach the tag. So that's some of what we're doing here. So this is Kayla again. She has a sonic receiver. So the tag and the belt both have a sonar pinger in them where we can listen for the manatees underwater. And hopefully if this guy's lost his tag but still has his belt, we would be able to find him using sonar and hopefully reattach his tag. I say hopefully a lot because it doesn't usually happen that way. If the animal's tag is still attached and it stops transmitting to the satellite, or maybe we need to replace the tag because the batteries are getting low, or maybe we're just going out to take observations. The main way we track them is using this VHF receiver. So it's a radio frequency. And this is another graduate student, Alan, and he is listening. This is a directional receiver, so he's listening to see which way it's beeping the loudest, and that will tell him which way the manatee is. And you can hear these guys using the VHF receiver for about a mile, so that's a pretty good range. But then just if, you know, the tag is working right, these guys could be hundreds of miles away, but I can log onto my laptop from right here at the Sea Lab and see where they're spending time by just logging into a tracking program that collects the satellite data. And we've tagged a total of 13 manatees since 2009. So we've collected a lot of great data on their movement. And here's an example of some of that data. This is some of Alan's work. So these guys are really quite the travelers, but they all travel a little differently, and they don't always follow the exact same travel patterns year after year. So on this map, Mobile Bay, this is where we are, obviously, and these orange dots are migratory endpoints. So these are where the animals are kind of coming to and going from. So much like, you know, if you're traveling along the interstate, you might stop at one of these purple dots as kind of like a rest stop. Maybe you're just stopping to get gas or get some food, or maybe you're going to spend a night here and then keep going, and ultimately you want to get to Port St. Joe where you're going to spend a couple months. That's what the manatees do. So they might stop over in these spots that have food and water and things they like, and then keep traveling. And Mobile Bay is a major migratory endpoint for these guys. So most of the manatees we see here either spend the winter in Crystal River or in Tampa, and then migrate up to Mobile Bay in the summer. And like I said, we see the same manatees come back year after year. This slide is kind of an example of what I was talking about with putting the different puzzle pieces together. So I know it's a lot to look at, but I'm going to try to just walk you through it. So we've talked about GPS telemetry, which is using the satellite tags, getting the satellite signal. And then with the sonar in the belt, not only can we actively listen for the manatees, but we can also put out these passive acoustic monitors. If any of you guys are familiar with fisheries research, a lot of fisheries scientists put these out to track tagged fish. We can do the same thing and check for the pinger in the belt if the manatee happens to swim by this PAM. And so when you're looking at an animal like Bama, so Bama is, we like to give them nicknames because they're easier to remember, but they all get a actual ID number as well. So this stands for Tagged Manatee, Alabama, and she was the first tagged manatee in Alabama. So you can see for the first part of the time she was tagged, we have these satellite data outlined in black, and that's great. We're getting lots of data. Then she loses her tag, but we pick her up again, swimming past a passive acoustic monitor, and here again, swimming past a passive acoustic monitor. So we're able to fill in some of these data gaps that we wouldn't otherwise have. And then for an animal like Zooey, who is the third animal tagged in Alabama, we have all this satellite data for him for the first couple years, and then we don't see him for about a year. He loses his gear, we don't see him. And then we have this photo ID. So a couple slides previous, I don't know if I can go back or not. So I think so. It's just, there's a little bit of a delay. Come on. So this is Zooey. So he has this really distinct scar on his tail. So we got a picture of that scar and we knew it was him. So we were able to then add to his movement and the data that we know about him with this photo ID hit. And Zooey is actually a manatee that we pretty much know about him from his birth all the way to when he unfortunately died from a boat strike in 2015. But he had a sighting history as a calf in Crystal River starting in 1987. So I always remember because Zooey and I are pretty much the same age. And then he unfortunately passed away in 2015 due to a boat strike here in Mobile Bay. But we were able to learn a lot about him over his lifetime. And then learn a lot about him even after he died. So Mackenzie talked to you a lot about stranding response yesterday, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here, but I will go over just a few things. So one of the things that was mentioned in my bio is that I was a part of the first manatee rescue in Alabama, which happened in 2015. So this actually happened over in Magnolia Springs in Baldwin County. There's a spring there, that's why they call it Magnolia Springs, where actually 3 manatees were functionally stranded. So it was very cold, but they're incredibly good at finding water that's just a little bit warmer than the surrounding water. And so these 3 manatees ended up there. One of them didn't make it. One of them we never found, but I think no news is good news. And then one of them we were able to rescue, again, with the help of SeaWorld's rescue team. And this is her. This is Magnolia. She was named after Magnolia Springs. She was rehabbed at SeaWorld for a couple of months where she gained about 200 pounds. That's just how sick and underweight she was. And then this picture here on the bottom is when she was re-released at Crystal River, and we put a tag on her so we could monitor her movements. She lost her tag only about 4 months after she was released, but she actually lost her tag around Apalachicola in the Panhandle. So she was back on her way to the Northern Gulf, and I'm always looking for someone to submit pictures of her, but haven't yet. We also, if an animal dies, perform necropsies and collect a lot of really valuable data from necropsies. I know Mackenzie probably spent a good bit of time talking to you about the different types of samples that we collect from necropsy. These are just a few of the suite of samples and types of analyses that we do. But I did want to take a minute to talk about something pretty cool you can do with manatees, and specifically with their ear bones. So if you guys, again, are familiar with fisheries research and familiar with fish otoliths, this is a very similar technique. In dolphins, we can also do this using their teeth. And for different species, there's a lot of different hard parts that you can use for these same types of analyses. But specifically in manatees, we use the periotic bone, which is part of the ear bone complex. So this is what it looks like when it comes out of the manatee and is sliced in half. And much like a tree ring, they lay down growth layers. So if you are lucky, you get nice clean growth layers. Younger animals typically have better growth layers. They start to squish together as the animals get older and are harder to count. But you can get an idea of this animal's age, and then doing some cool elemental and isotopic work can get an idea of what it was exposed to throughout its life. So that kind of idea of you are what you eat, or you are what your environment is. We can look at different elements, and this is just an example. So this is strontium and barium, which are salinity indicators. And the main thing to take away from this, two main things to take away from this. This is some of Kayla's work that is going to be part of her dissertation. But you can see this up and down pattern for both strontium and barium. And it's happening about annually. So this is indicative to us of going from a more freshwater environment and eating more freshwater plants like we have in the Northern Gulf, to migrating back to Florida and eating more saltwater marine grasses. So you can see that interannual variation. There's also, in a lot of these guys, you can see a shift from when they go from the first few years of their life, where they're primarily drinking milk from their moms, to going to a totally vegetation-based diet. And you can see how the elements change when they do that. So stay tuned for Kayla's dissertation, because this is a large part of it. She's doing a lot more cool work, but this is just an example, of something that we can do from a necropsy and that we can learn. And take an unfortunate situation of an endangered species death, but still use that to collect some really great data that we can then use to inform conservation for the population as a whole. And the last part of this section, before I spend just a little bit of time talking to you about, okay, what should you actually do if you see a manatee, is how we actually apply these data. So I've said lots of times, we collect this data and then we apply it to conservation, but what does that actually mean? So we do things like species priority classifications. So before the sighting network, manatees were considered accidental in Alabama, so meaning they were just lost if they came here. But now they're a priority species under the state's Department of Fish and Wildlife. We've also did a lot of work after the oil spill to help inform how the oil spill affected these animals. And we do a lot of consulting or data requests for environmental impacts. So, everything we do as humans here on the Gulf Coast and along these manatee habitats has the potential to affect the manatees. So when people are doing everything from boat races to construction and restoration, a big one, the Mobile Bay Bridge construction project that may happen one day, who knows, but they're coming to us and asking, how might our activities impact manatees? And a lot of times for a big construction project, it's actually required that they get that impact assessment so that they can address how they're going to try to mitigate and manage potential harm to these animals. And this is, for me as, a kid who always grew up and went to school and wanted to work in conservation biology, like this is really it. This is what all the hard work goes into informing, so that we're actually making a difference to these guys' this conservation and impacting how they're managed, especially in our region where they're becoming more and more common. So that's a lot about our research. In the last few minutes before I turn it over to questions, I'm going to just switch gears and talk about, okay, now you know what we've been learning, but what if you guys actually see a manatee? What should you do? So the first thing is to just know what you're looking for. So in crystal clear water like Crystal River, it's really easy to spot these manatees, right? In more turbid, freshwater influenced environments like Mobile Bay, and this is over in the West Pascagoula River in Mississippi, it's a lot harder to see these manatees. You might just see a nose at the surface when they take a breath, or see these footprints is what we call them. It's made from their tails moving up and down. They have these big round tails that basically suck the water down, pull the water down when they swim. And if you know what you're looking for, it looks quite different than other types of splashes, or like if a fish jumps, it leaves more of a spiral pattern. So even if you don't see a manatee, you might still see this footprint that gives the manatee away. And I'll play you guys a couple of videos of what to do and what not to do. So anything that changes a manatee's natural, go back, well, hopefully these videos work. Anything that changes a manatee's natural behavior is considered harassment. But most people have no idea they're doing any harm, and never would want to hurt a manatee intentionally, so we are really just trying to educate. So here you have some manatees that are, clearly not interested in hanging out with this guy in the kayak and trying to move away. And he's continuing to pursue them and then getting really, really close. This makes me uncomfortable every time I see it, because it's not only dangerous for the manatee and technically illegal, what he's doing, but it's really dangerous for him. These are, not predators and naturally not aggressive animals, but they're really big and can cause damage. And if you startle them and they take off or flap that tail really quickly, they could really hurt you, definitely snap your kayak. So instead, better things to do are just to give the animals space. They're naturally very curious, so they'll oftentimes come up to you. But this guy's still a little bit close, but these manatees are changing their behavior. They're chowing down on these plants by the shoreline, and not being interacted with. And this is the same, reason that we, discourage touching or feeding, or giving a water hose to manatees. That's quite, commonly done without knowing why it could be harmful. But these guys, we want them to have a safe, fear of humans. We don't want them to approach humans. If they're approaching a boat with a propeller spinning, that could be dangerous. If they're approaching people fishing, they could get tangled in lines, and that could be very dangerous to them. And if they're, getting fed or watered and it starts to get cold and they should be hightailing it back to Florida, they might not get their migration cues because they're staying to eat at the buffet. And so that could ultimately be fatal to them if they don't migrate appropriately. So just know that these guys, they can take care of themselves, and just the best thing you can do, if you just remember one thing, is just to give them some space. And so along with, our research and being a citizen science network, we do a lot of education and outreach, and I manage a lot of that as part of this program. So we distribute metal dock signs that people can put up on their houses or their waterfront property. We do talks like this, so thank you for inviting me. Talk to school groups, have open houses, go to local boat shows, distribute things like boat decals and magnets, and also work with Save the Manatee Club to distribute a lot of materials, and even have an Adopt an Alabama Manatee program with them. So by doing all of this, we're really, really truly a network. So I don't exist. I'm just one person without all of you guys contributing to our network and helping ensure that we continue to learn about these manatees and that we help keep them safe. So summing it all up, what we've learned about these guys is a lot. We now have going on 14 years of sighting network data, along with almost 100 years of historical data that we've collected. Our actually earliest sighting of a manatee in Alabama was a carcass, but was in Mobile Bay in 1912. So the idea of having a 100-year data set on an animal in the ecology biology world is just kind of crazy. So this has really allowed us to learn that these guys are regular seasonal visitors. They're not lost when they come to the Northern Gulf. And if they're spending 8-9 months of the year here when it's warm, this might be more home to them than Florida is. And we can also identify these habitat hotspots, where these guys really travel and spend time. And we can use that information to help make sure that people and manatees are safely coexisting in our local waterways. And using citizen science is super effective. We could never learn as much as we have or cover, as much ground without the help of so many people that live and work and visit along the Gulf Coast. And spreading that message through outreach really, really works. And like I said, makes us truly the Manatee Sighting Network. So again, I appreciate you guys letting me talk to you a bit today. And with that, along with thanking you, I, of course, just have to take a second to acknowledge the rest of my team at the Sea Lab, along with the many volunteers and other agencies that fund us and work with us and allow us to do what we do. And yeah, lastly, I'll take any questions. This picture is actually from just about 2 months ago. This is in Gulf Shores, so when they opened back up the beaches, all the people went to the beach, and this manatee also went to the beach. So I think it's a pretty cool picture. But I'm gonna close out of my screen so I can see you guys again. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. That was a really cool presentation. Definitely learned a lot. We have quite a few questions in the chat box. I'm going to let Boris go ahead and ask his on the migration, which I know you touched on a little bit, but
yeah, sure. Bring them on.
Hey, mine was, do you know if there's like a stable population that just like chills in the bay or the Gulf, or is like migration a necessary thing for the species?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the kind of $20,000 questions. And one of the things that we're trying to answer by using trace elements, isotopes, and genetics also. Right now, our best picture of what's going on is that they are all part of one population, and there is just a portion of the population that travels here. But because they all ultimately go back to Florida, they're all breeding together as one population, and so we can't call this a separate population. But kind of the second part of your question is, do they have to go back to Florida? And when I started this job, I would have said, yeah, absolutely, you can't have manatees in Alabama year-round. And now I think that that is probably not true. I think we're getting more and more evidence that at least some manatees have figured out how to overwinter in the Northern Gulf. And I think, time and more research will tell if, before we can really kind of prove that. But I have a feeling that there's at least a few that have figured out they don't have to go back to Florida. They can stay up here all year. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much.
all right. And then Austin, you want to ask your question that I just sent you? Kind of follows along with the topic.
I was going to ask, what is the farthest north you've ever tracked a manatee traveling?
Yeah, okay, so the furthest north, it wasn't with active tracking with a satellite tag, but we actually got pictures of a manatee at the Claiborne Lock and Dam. I don't know if you're familiar with Claiborne, Alabama, but it's about 100 miles north of Mobile. So he basically just got all the way to the dam and couldn't go any further. There's also, I think the furthest north along the Atlantic coast that manatees have ever been documented is Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And there's kind of a famous case, you could Google it, of a manatee that went all the way up to Memphis. He went all the way up the Mississippi River to Memphis. I think in the early 2000s. He did not make it. That's not really a thing that they should be doing, but still an interesting case.
All right, and then John, you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I can ask it. I was just wondering if there has been any manatees born in Mobile Bay.
Yeah, that's a great question too. So we know, this is kind of sad, but we know of at least one manatee that was born in Mobile Bay because it was stillborn. And we actually recovered the carcass of the calf and did a necropsy. But we have over the years gotten a few documented cases of moms with calves in Mobile Bay. Now, whether they were born here or maybe traveled here, I think it's probably, if it's a small calf, I think it's less likely that they traveled all the way from Florida. I think it's more likely they were born here. We do get a lot of reports of calves, but more often it's usually just smaller and larger manatees. But yeah, there's been at least one calf born here, and we've definitely seen calves in our local waters.
And then Eric, do you want to ask your question? Just kind of switching gears a little bit.
The question I originally sent?
No, the one I just sent you.
What brought you to having this position, and what made you fall in love with it?
Oh, okay. Good question. As Carrie said in my bio, I actually originally worked with turtles in grad school. And I'm still like a secret herpetologist at heart. Like I love the crocodile hunter and like want to work with like turtles and alligators and all those things. But this position actually came open right around the time I was finishing my master's. And it just had a lot of the things that I loved as far as being able to do the research, but also being able to apply it and to actually go out and talk to people, to make connections with other groups, and to actually, feel like, because at this time I was also potentially going to take a position at the med school at South, working in a lab, and I don't know that I would have been as happy, just working in a lab and kind of never seeing the data like go somewhere. And that's something I just really love about this job, is that I spend a lot of my time talking to people about manatees and hearing their stories, and really like seeing them spark an interest and spark like a care for these animals that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have. And so while I spend way more of my time doing paperwork than like on the boat with my wind, like the wind in my hair, like people probably think, it's still very rewarding. And it's never boring, and like no 2 days are ever the same.
That's really cool. So we got quite a few questions about like interacting with manatees.
Okay.
And Kate mentioned that she was able to go this past, I don't know when it was, but this past like winter, springtime, and actually get to interact with them. So yeah, basically the question is, what would be a safe way to do that? Like, where's a good place to go?
Yeah, so there are two places in the U.S. where it's sanctioned to actually go and swim with the manatees, and that's in Crystal River, and then it's like 10 minutes down the road is a place called Homosassa Springs. And it's probably like a 7-8 hour drive, a little bit above Tampa. Just a little quiet town that is really just known for the manatees and is a destination for the manatees. But that is a place you can go where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service actually really sanctions what's going on. There are tour groups you can go out with, and that the manatees have a place to go. So there are sanctuaries within the springs where the manatees have, like a safe zone that they can go if they don't want to interact with you. And also if it gets really, really cold and the manatees just need access to the springs and don't need to be bothered at all, Fish and Wildlife will just shut down the swim with activities. So that's really, the places that I tell people to go. If you want to take like a weekend trip and maybe see manatees but not swim with them, Wakulla Springs is a place just south of Tallahassee in the Panhandle that is the closest place where there's resident manatees year-round. And it's a state park, and they have a really great like boat tour you can take on the river, and if you don't see manatees, you'll see tons of like birds and gators and turtles and all kinds of other fun things. But you're also pretty likely to see manatees. But yeah, up here, you know, I think people sometimes maybe get a little bit of the wrong idea from going to Crystal River and just want to go jump in the water with the manatees. But it's just always, you know that when they're in Crystal River and they're cold and they're all aggregated together and it's well supervised, that's one thing. Actually, like jumping in and going crazy with the manatees up here is something completely different and could be very dangerous for both you and the manatee.
All right, and then kind of moving to more current events, I'm going to ask for Ashley because I know her microphone doesn't work real well, but she had asked if what's been going on in the world, has it affected your ability to source data, like with people not being outdoors as much?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think it's actually turned out the opposite of what I thought. I was really kind of nervous going into this sighting season of, you know, everybody's going to be quarantined, and so I'm not, like, we're not going to get any sightings, we're not going to get any data. But I think, honestly, the opposite has happened, and if you've spent any time, like, driving past local boat ramps or seeing images from the beaches, there are so many people out. And when the governor put in place, you know, stay-at-home orders, one of the things that people could still do was go out on their boats. And honestly, I never knew so many people had boats in Mobile and Baldwin counties. So we've actually, I was just writing our newsletter for the summer, and we've had over 75 sightings in Alabama already this year, which, you know, normally for the whole year we have maybe 400. So having 75 by, you know, early June is kind of crazy. So I think we're actually busier instead of not being busy.
And then Creighton has one on the more of the environment side of things, if you want to ask Creighton.
Yeah, my question is basically, I know with like climate change, they say there's going to be like winners and losers, mostly losers, but just hearing you talk about how like winter stress is like a limiting factor for them, I was curious if you think that climate change will positively or negatively affect the manatee population.
Yeah, so there's a couple great papers out there about this. One by Holly Edwards and another by Dr. Helene Marsh about how manatees and sirenians might react to climate change, and it's kind of a mixed bag. So definitely, we think that you know, these guys will probably be able to expand their range and expand where they're able, you know, to spend time. So for a growing population, that's a good thing. But at the same time, you're also potentially going to have more human manatee conflict. And while it may be a little different in the US, in developing countries where there are other species of manatees and dugongs, and where there's still things like hunting and, you know, and poaching, like there may be, it may actually turn into more of a conflict as climate change affects resources that, you know, people are basically competing with the manatees for. And interestingly, in Africa, manatees actually are considered like a huge nuisance because they'll eat fish, they'll steal fish from fishermen's nets. So those kind of conflicts might increase. And also, with climate change, there's the potential for more and stronger tropical storms and hurricanes, which could impact manatees. I don't think we fully understand how that will work yet. But yeah, definitely, if this is a topic you're interested in, there are Holly Edwards' paper and Helene Marsh's paper, and if you know, Carrie knows how to get in touch with me, if I can send anybody papers or topics that they're interested in, I'm happy to.
Yeah, and kind of along with that, we always ask if there would be any resources that you would suggest or any books if we wanted to learn more about the topic or even just science in general. So if you have any recommendations.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely, you know, go to our website, go to our Facebook page. Our Facebook page is a great way to get kind of, you know, stay up to date with what we're doing. That's the only social media we have right now. I don't think I'm not one of the young cool kids that had set up all the other things for our platform yet. But go like us on Facebook and go play around the website, and also not just the Manatee website, but I would suggest just the C-Lab website in general, disl.org, because there's a lot of different research going on at the lab, and even within our marine mammal research program that, Mackenzie and I didn't even talk about. And particularly if you go to my lab, the Carmichael lab, we have a full list of all the publications that have come out of our lab. And yeah, just, definitely look around, and if there's a certain like paper or book or something that you guys find that like you can't get access to, like through your institution or whatever, definitely like contact me, and we probably have it. So I'd be happy to share it with you.
Right, and then Eric, I'm gonna let you ask that last question since you asked Mackenzie yesterday.
Oh God, Mackenzie and I are getting the same question. Oh, okay.
So, how you doing? Would you rather be a manatee or a dolphin?
Oh goodness. Okay. Oh gosh, this is a tough question.
Just go with turtle. It wasn't an option, but it should be.
No matter what I say, you have to say that I gave a better answer than Mackenzie. Okay, you can't tell her that she gave a better answer because she'll never let me live it down. I think that I think I might actually be kind of bored as a manatee. Like, I feel like they're bored a lot of the time. Like, when we get tagging data back, these guys have gone into like every little nook and cranny in the streams because I think they're just like hungry and bored all the time. And I don't know that that's how I would want to be. So how I would want to exist. So maybe I'd rather like work for my food a little bit, like have to chase fish. Maybe I'd rather be a dolphin. But then I wouldn't have such a cute, squishy little face. So it's a really hard question. So yeah, I'm gonna say C, none of the above, and I'd rather be a turtle.
Can't do that.
Yeah.
It has to be an answer she answered. You have to.
Well, I would say probably dolphin over manatee if I absolutely had to.
Can you guess what
Mackenzie
she said?
Yeah, she chose dolphin as well, but it was for the boat, for boat reasons, like less likely to be hit. So.
Yeah, I would like to be able to like get out of the way if there was a boat coming at me. But I don't know. Either one. Dolphins have their own issues too. But yes, Mackenzie is always trying to like promote the dolphin more because they're just not as cute as the manatees. They're very, very cool creatures, but they just aren't as naturally like squishy and cute.
Well, that's all we had for questions. Unless anyone has a last minute one, I'll open up the floor now. But otherwise, I'll hand it to you, Carrie.
Yeah, I think we'll just go ahead and wrap things up then, and just say again, thank you to Elizabeth and Mackenzie as well. And I know I talked to Mackenzie a little bit yesterday about hopefully getting our team down there to maybe get trained on some of this stuff, since we'll have a smaller team next year, and have that be our pilot into introducing golf course to this program, and hopefully help you guys out. So hopefully we'll continue this partnership in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much. This has been a lot of fun.
Awesome. Have a great day.
All right, bye everybody. Bye, Leonard. Oh, he's so bored. He just wants to sleep. Bye, guys. Thank you so much.
Hi, thank you.
Would have been a manatee. I ain't gonna lie to you.
But I'd prefer to be a squishy sea potato as well.
I'm telling you, I need to create a group of like turtle lovers, because I did not realize how many there are in this area, and I'm so stoked. gonna have to come up with a tattoo we can all get. Anyways, see y'all at the debrief.
Yeah, you guys are good for the bug assignment. And I'll see you at 4 o'clock. Remember the potential employer is going to talk to us. So be on time.
Brett,
Yep.
I guess we need to do evals.
Yeah, did you find that link?
I didn't find the emails they sent me. Oh no.